Iran's supreme leader says Hamas is, quote, alive and will survive following the killing of its leader in Gaza. The group's deputy leader has now confirmed the death of Yahya Sinwar, but says the fight will go on, insisting no hostages will be released unless Israel withdraws from Gaza. Israel's military has released footage from the operation that killed Sinwar. He can be seen sitting in the ruins of a building that came under assault in southern Gaza on Wednesday. He's considered the chief architect of last year's terror attacks on Israel. And with Yahya Sinwar now eliminated, attention is turning to who might become the next leader of Hamas.
Allahu Akbar.
Friday prayers for Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. The deaths of Sinwar and other Hamas commanders leave the militant group leaderless. While much of Gaza lies in ruins, thousands of its fighters are thought to be still active and ready to take on Israeli ground forces. So who could now fill the vacuum at the top of Hamas? Among those tipped to replace Sinwar is his deputy Khalil al-Hayya, who confirmed the killing. He previously led the Hamas delegation at talks which failed to secure a ceasefire with Israel. Another contender is Khalid Meshal, seen here returning to Gaza for the first time in 45 years. He led Hamas for more than a decade until 2017, after surviving a poisoning attempt by Israeli agents in the 1990s. Rarely seen in public is Mohammed Sinwar, on the right in this video released by Israel, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, who was assassinated this week. Mohammed Sinwar is also on Israel's wanted list and has survived several attempts on his life. A fourth possibility is the 79-year-old hardliner Mahmoud al-Sahar, known as the General for his uncompromising views on Israel. Israel says it was this tank attack which killed Yahya Sinwar in Rafah. No matter who takes over Hamas, Israel's Prime Minister has made it clear the war will not be over until all the hostages held by Hamas in Gaza return home.
And for more, I am joined by our correspondent, Emily Gordine, in Jerusalem. Emily, as you surely know, Iran's supreme leader says Hamas is, quote, alive and will survive. I know it's early hours, but how might this statement be perceived by the Netanyahu government?
Well, look, what is coming out of Iran is very much echoed with Hamas as well, which came out after Sinwar's death saying that it would only strengthen the group. Now Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, came out as well and in contradictory terms essentially said that Hamas will not govern Gaza any longer, and this is the start of the day after Hamas. And of course, what Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying there also ties into the goals that Israel laid out at the very beginning of the war following Hamas's terror attacks on Israel on October 7th last year, that it wants to destroy and dismantle Hamas, and that is essentially what it's been doing over the past year. At the same time, of course, that has come at a high cost to the civilian population in Gaza. And the question in Israel is, at this point now, where will this all lead? Because this is not the first time that Israel has destroyed leaders and have terrorist organizations. And so far, it is not very, it's not easy to see a path forward in terms of strategy, in terms of where this is all going in Gaza.
Everyone is projecting into the future, and the speculation has surely begun. Is Sinwar's death a window of opportunity for a diplomatic resolution?
Well, for many people, that is the hope. So if you look at the people in Gaza who have been suffering now for a year under the fighting that's been going on between the Israeli military and Hamas, but also if you look at international countries, international partners of Israel abroad, US President Joe Biden, he came out shortly after Sinwar's death, while he was still in Berlin visiting German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, saying that this is a moment that could be taken as an opportunity for a path to peace. And of course, the families in Israel who still have members who are still hostage in Gaza, they're also hoping that this is a moment to broker a deal to get the hostages out. And at the same time, this is not the signal, this is not what we're hearing from Israeli leadership, and this is also not what we're hearing from Hamas leadership. Both sides are intent on continuing the fighting, and so far on both fronts, not just in Gaza, but also we're hearing similar tones when it comes to what's happening in southern Lebanon. So even though international partners, but also hostage families would like to see this as an opportunity to stop the fighting itself continues as it was.
That's Emily Gordine in Jerusalem. Many, many thanks.
All right, Laura Blumenfeld is a Middle East analyst at Johns Hopkins University. She joins me now for more. Laura, welcome to the show. We now have Hamas's initial response to Sinwar's killing. How optimistic should we be that his death could lead to any kind of resolution of this current conflict?
Yeah, I think it's a moment of great promise and great peril. I mean, we have some promise. The Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, offered amnesty to Hamas fighters who laid down their arms. He said to them very clearly, leave and live. If they release the hostages, there's a deal to be made. Secretary Blinken, our Secretary of State, is flying to the region looking for a broader ceasefire deal. That said, there is great peril. Both Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, if we're looking at the whole ring of fire, seem to be hardening their positions, which gives great concern, particularly for the hostage lives, and then beyond that for the war continuing. And then there's this looming strike on Iran that Israel has been promising in retaliation for a missile strike on Israel back on October 1st. So there's military momentum behind Israel, which makes me think we may not be quite at the end of the fighting phase quite yet.
At the same time, we know that Sinwar's potential successors are generally seen as moderate by comparison. Do we have any sense of what that could mean for the scope of the conflict and how Hamas will come back from this?
Well, I think, Sinwar is dead. Hamas is very much alive. But, desperate men, desperate measures. For Israel, it's all about the hostages from a kind of public opinion point of view and political support for Netanyahu. So if there's desperation and, kind of weakness and a fracturing of the Hamas leadership, that could be very dangerous. I think that Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, are kind of on they're channeling a lot of biblical quotes there of an eye for an eye, and we will take down our enemies. He was quoted, the Secretary of Defense was quoting from Leviticus yesterday, saying that we will beat our enemies with swords. So I just worry that this kind of decentralization of control under Hamas could potentially lead to even more violence.
You touched on this a bit, but what does Sinwar's death mean in this broader conflict between Israel and its enemies? You mentioned Iran, you mentioned the fight against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Does this embolden Israel in a way even more to continue with those despite all of the international pressure? What do you see?
With all the problems in Gaza, Israel actually has a larger problem, which is Iran, nuclear weapons, and a global network of hostile proxies. So I do think Israel's very much focused on Iran as the next step. I would look toward next week. Thursday night going into Friday is the Jewish anniversary of the holiday of Simchat Torah, where that first ambush took place on the secular calendar. It would be October 7th, but for the Jewish state, it's next week. So I think, when I spoke to my sources, Israeli intelligence sources, and I said, is there going to be a strike before the U.S. election or after? The answer was both. So that strike on Iran is probably going to be the next step, unless Secretary Blinken succeeds with his proposal. And I would just suggest that he go modest, because the higher the diving board, the bigger the belly flop. And that could be embarrassing for the United States, especially 18 days out from the presidential election.
We talk about Sinwar's death as a potential turning point. You've mentioned the election. How significant a turning point is that potentially for what's going on?
Well, President Biden, as he spoke today, he said that he had a phone call with Netanyahu and he told him to choose to seek a path toward peace. The issue with Netanyahu is I think that path might involve a trip to Tehran by the Israeli Air Force. I mean, we share the same goals as Israel. Everybody wants Israel to push back against that axis of resistance and defeat terrorism. The question is at what cost? For Israel, it is at all costs. Because they see it as an existential fight. For the United States, there are many priorities, right? There's international prestige, given the humanitarian crisis, that's really put a dent in the United States' credibility abroad. There's our other priorities of pushing back on China and aggressive Russia. It's divided the Democratic Party for this administration. It's also opened them up to charges of looking weak and inept. So I think the next couple of days are going to be really important. This is our October surprise, I think, Sinwar's death. And the question is how we can leverage that potentially toward a solution, which eventually will have to be something political on the horizon.
That's Laura Blumenfeld with Johns Hopkins University. Thank you very much.
Thank you.